The Middle East is changing. The world is changing. And we will try to decipher this together. Today I have the distinct pleasure and honor to have Mr. Ioannis Koskinas, the CEO of the Hoplite Group out of Washington, D.C. in the United States of America. My name is Dr. Marios Eftimiopoulos, and this is Prime Analysis. Dear Ioannis, thank you very much for joining us in this web series at Strategy International. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I would like to have a discussion with you if that's possible, and there's no better person to tell us a bit of the Middle East. So I will start with the current state of affairs. I mean, we would like to explain with the world to the world actually what's happening nowadays, if you want, with the Middle East. What is happening? What is the state of affairs in the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East has been the center of geopolitics for quite some time. I mean, depending on who you talk to, they can argue how far back. But as long as energy is sort of a key component of any geopolitical construct, I think that the Middle East will continue to play a key role. It's an intersection of different cultures, obviously, an intersection of different capabilities, enormous wealth, resources. So the idea that the Middle East is somehow diminished is from the international stage is a bit of a misnomer. There's some, particularly in my country, in the U.S., that have made the argument about pivoting to China as the peer competitor or the strategic competition foe of choice or competitor of choice. And the way I describe it is that it may be that China is a competitor, but the reality is that the competition doesn't necessarily take place in the Taiwan Straits or even in the Pacific. So I think the Middle East remains a key component or a key, geolocation and an intersection for just about everything that's going on, regardless who the competitors are or have been.
I would like to take it a bit from a geopolitical point of view. So I would like to go around the Middle East, taking into account several countries. Sure. I would like to discuss a bit about the economics, the politics, the strategic parts, if you want, also. So let me say the following.
Sure.
It seems that the United States has a different opinion and view, taken from what you just told me, with regard to the Middle East. It seems also that China has a different point of view. And it is of no coincidence that China pivoted initially into Iran since 2016, an agreement that was reached in the beginning of 2020. And now we see them somehow reapproaching the level of Iran-Saudi relations, which, as you can understand, a few months ago probably, or even a few days ago, would kind of look like a probable not possible to take place. I mean, and now it seems China is kind of answering to the United States, look what we can do, unlike what you have done in the Middle East and Central Asia for the last 25 years, let's say. What's your take on this?
Well, look, China is an opportunist, but China doesn't do things without a long-term view. So I think in many regards, I'm sure you would agree that the Chinese plans are not something that just came out on Tuesday.
Yeah.
This is something that's been ongoing for quite some time. The influence campaign to have them grow in status has been steady and consistent, whereas the U.S. may have concentrated on security and countering violent extremism and in many regards cooperate with regional governments with a security construct. Certainly that's what I've been focusing in on, and you have been super well versed in. But the reality is that China has needs that the Middle East is providing for. In some cases, Iran has problems with the U.S. and my enemy is the enemy of my enemy is my friend construct allows for China to engage and have been engaged with Iran for quite some time, whether it's sanctions busting for Iran or whether it's just purely fulfilling its energy needs, engaging with the Middle East to fulfill what some may perceive as a U.S. Disengagement. There's a lot at play, and I don't think that we can underestimate the impact of the situation in Ukraine because
Absolutely.
that has also created mechanisms for China, Russia, Iran to come together. The axis of evil of the early 2000s
Yeah, yeah.
are not necessarily just with North Korea in there, but now you have the perception of China, Iran, and Russia working together in some ways. So I don't think it's anything that's enormously new. I'm not really sure that even you could say that China obviously played some role in the Iran Saudi rapprochement with the embassies and the decisions to open up embassies in various countries. But you and I both know that has been in the works for quite some time, and the fact that China puts a stamp on it is
Yeah.
is one thing, but in some ways, it's a snub for other things that are going on this planet, particularly between the U.S. and Saudi, Saudi and Iran, Iran and U.S. Well, China is somewhere in there as well. So not to underscore their play. I think it's a significant play, but I also think a lot of people are somehow waking up to it right now, and all of a sudden it's something that it's completely new, and it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is not, Iran may not be the first country. It seems that they came quite stronger in another country that you know better than a lot of us, Afghanistan. The moment the U.S. withdrew and seems Qatar was there, about a few months later, China comes along with big contracts for reconstruction, probably for resources, for natural use of resources. And it seems, and this is the scary thing, if you want, they came with a ready plan on where to go, which resources they need, and how do they need these resources. Now, funnily enough, you mentioned at some point Ukraine. Another point of concern that China is also involved since 2013 in a very big oblast within Ukraine, where it has satisfied some of its agricultural needs, and Ukraine being one of the very few countries that actually provide China with its needs with regards to agriculture. Now, the irony with this is that in that area there's no war whatsoever. And exactly because
Mm.
China controls it, it has rented it out from Ukraine, and it's a big area, more than 3 million hectares, if I'm correct. Now, just coming back to China, one of the things that I've seen over the last years, namely in the Gulf also, is that they were trying to pivot themselves in the Gulf. And I think one of the biggest elements is that they were trying to go they still do, I still believe that they're trying to do, to go to Africa through land, not only sea. I mean, we've seen what they've done in Senegal and so on and so forth, the Chinese themselves. But one thing to say is that China is a country that really doesn't give up. And I repeat, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. China doesn't
Hmm.
stop because it needs and wants to consume, presumably for its internal affairs. The question is, how does it believe it reshapes the world? I mean, in Washington, it's been seen, and I think several articles in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and goes on and on. They're already attempting to say that probably the presence of China diminishes the power, the pivoting power, as you mentioned, correct, in the Middle East. So my question to you now goes: what the U.S. intends to do with regards to China in the Middle East, and then we will be looking, if you want, at the Middle Eastern countries on how they see both China and the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really key component of this that you brought up that I want to zero in on because it's something that I think I hope the audience and quite frankly anybody who will listen take stock in. Whether you're the US, whether you're Greece, whether you're Cyprus, whether you're Turkey, whether you're anybody, I mean, when you're engaging, whether you're a CEO of a company and you're trying to get your board to do something,
Yeah.
one of the key components of decision making is actually understanding the environment that you're about to
To
enter.
enter, yeah.
Something that you're supposed to understand is the very basics of the ecosystem that you're about to disturb one way or another, hopefully for your benefit. When I hear something about recent escapades from China or the somehow, we woke up yesterday and now we're in a strategic competition with China, whether again, it could be EU with China, it could be something else. I think talking about this stuff without considering what has been going on and what the environment that we're talking about has been for some time is a bit of it's an intellectually numbing exercise. And I'll give you very specific examples. The China Belt and Road, not that this is what we want to talk about, but we could commit multiple conversations on that, has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been going on for quite some time. So the fact that, China has been trying to invest in, to use your term earlier, Afghanistan, through the entire existence of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, or shortly after its initial re-engagement with Afghanistan, that's about 20 years in the making. Going into Gwadar port in Pakistan, and when you drive through Pakistan and you see signs in Chinese on the highways, that should give a clue that somebody didn't just wake up and China just started doing this. The port of Piraeus in Athens, and the investment that Chinese have put into that port, the railways through the Balkans all the way to Eastern Europe.
Absolutely.
These aren't things that just happen.
So there's a plan.
In the Middle East, I mean, it's a plan. It's a long-term plan, and they don't have. I mean, President Xi just signed up for his third term as president. They don't have to worry about these 3 or 4 or 5 year terms, and their plan is certainly more coherent. Now, I'm not suggesting that their program is better than anybody else's. Certainly, don't aspire towards communism. The joke that in communism, you have 2 cows, the state takes both of them and gives you some milk occasionally. I mean, that's not for me.
Yeah.
But for sure, the idea that somehow China is a new kid on the block, it's ridiculous. And we can go into specific countries, and you can see that their game plan is nuanced and it's specific to them, and they consider needs that those countries may have in order for them to engage in ways that are attractive. They have a smart play.
Can I just add a few things here? This is the way that presumably the U.S. sees it. Now, here's one question that comes to one's mind, and before I actually go straight on the Middle East and go country by country, how does the EU see the whole fight between, the U.S. fight, the potentiality of control or direct link with trade and business and so on between the U.S. and China? Because in the Gulf or in the Middle East or in the Southeast Med, we know that both countries are great powers, whether this for consumption or military power or military might or demographics or culture, you name it. But what comes very strong is that the EU has a different opinion about those things. And in fact, the EU is been seen from Mohammed bin Salman, if you remember correct, there was a conference where he said, he didn't say we will become the United States in the Middle East, but he stated that the Middle East will become the new Europe. And he said that in Europe because Europe has rules, regulations, culture, history, and a lot of other things that, make up for what you have today in Europe. But he compared it with Europe. So if the Middle East is to become a new Europe, with all the new values and the sets of values, where do they belong in this world arena? Do they belong in the West? Do they belong in the East? Or is it a new pillar where all competition comes as an end product in the Gulf and the Middle East as a ready product, and whoever does more wins?
I, if you permit me, I would be a little bit contrarian to this, or this idea, because I think the Middle East should just stay the way it is.
Mm.
I don't, there's a reason why Europeans like you and me, although obviously I'm an American, but of European origins, I can recognize Europe. I can appreciate its beauty. I can appreciate it, warts and all. I love Europe. Same with my country. In the U.S. But I choose to look at the Middle East for what it is, not in some, you know, I don't even want to call it neo-colonial view of changing it into Europe.
This is how they. Well, no,
I'm sorry.
Europe is over its colonial period, at least officially. I just want to challenge you a bit, if you permit. You
Yeah.
say let's keep the
Yeah.
Middle
Sure.
East.
Yeah. Of course.
Let's permit the Middle East as it is. I mean, it's not really peaceful or
Right.
progressively successful. I mean, considering Lebanon with economic crisis, Syria with an ongoing civil and crisis and military affairs and terrorist groups being involved and separatist movements
Sure.
and all the other countries trying, on the neighborhood, or Turkey, for example, having the illegal control of the northern part of Syria. Then similarly, you have in Iraq, you also have the dynamics of the Kurds. You also have Afghanistan, a non-ending story, a vacuum that somebody can call a vacuum. You also have Kuwait, which is ever closed, if you want, to international push. I mean, it's a most traditional country in the Gulf. And on the other hand, you have Qatar with all the massive investments and now trying to balance the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are again part of the GCC. Now, Qatar every now and then is showing off its magnificence in terms of financial concerns. You saw Al Thani trying to buy Manchester United, for example, in football with $5 billion of proposal. I mean, which is enormous money. For football, so they're trying to show off in different qualities. Or the UAE, which is the total opposite, which is trying to be very open, at the same time very tolerant. It has a policy on tolerance, coexistence, interreligious dialogue, a hub to be, a hub to do, but then again very volatile. The area of the Gulf, considering the unfinished war in Yemen. Which is ongoing, and I mean the UN is working on it. Probably experts are working on it, but it's not prime time element because everybody's concentrating in Ukraine. So there are different issues ahead of us. The Middle East is in a different shape. Saudi Arabia, 2 years on, 3 years on, it's a totally different market economy, totally different opportunity. They want to be the land of opportunity. So on the one hand, we say yes, okay, Middle East should be staying like this. On the other hand, it's progressively changing. Yet again, the Middle East has very many things to say about culture and history and religious also affairs, but also the length and the depth of history in the Middle East that is associated with everything basically. And then you have Iran, which are former Persia and now Iran, which is theocratic as a system, a rule of governance, and you don't know how things are going to go in the near future. In the Middle East, you have another asset country, which is Israel. And Israel is also have, the best, it considers itself to be the best ally of the United States, but trying to pivot, whether this is in Syria or Iran. So is this really the Middle East that we want? Is this the Middle East going by itself? In the Middle East, that was last week in the Gulf, and I could hear some experts stating that it is our time now. It is our security, opportunity to work on a security system, which we know that there are discussions since 2005. But this time they're expressively saying, without the West, without the East, we can do it ourselves. So where do we stand with regards to these dynamics when we talk about the Middle East?
Please don't mistake my statement that that the Middle East should, stay the Middle East. I'm not saying that, if you, as you do as well, when you talk to Middle Eastern based, anything,
Mm.
they'd be the first to tell you that we need to change some things, we
Absolutely.
need to improve, we need to
Yes,
evolve, we need to
you're right.
grow, we need to, continue our journey,
Yes,
in a way that it's advancing. And they're putting their money and their intellectual capital and, quite frankly, their youth, and innovation towards that. I'm not, but that's an evolutionary sort of. They're looking for that growth. All I'm suggesting is that there's this tendency from, certainly from the U.S., to walk into country X and say you need to be more like us, or
yeah,
from Europe, somebody that shows up and you need to be more like, and that's the
exactly.
circumstance that I think that they're exposed. They go to the universities in Europe or in the Middle East, other Middle Eastern countries or US. They see they're exposed to different things, and they can take whatever they want and bring it back. But it has to be kind of a. And by the way, that's a very different approach, what I just described, to the Chinese approach. Which the Chinese approach is, they're going to bring their own people to do certain things. They're not going to hire Emiratis or Qataris or Iraqis to do a lot of stuff. You'll see them bringing their own people to take care of certain things. So yeah, that's what I mean. Just clarifying. I think that's the journey that the Middle East is on is pretty unique.
Just to add here, I overheard once a discussion recently that the Chinese are now interested in the academic system in terms of business and investment
Yeah,
stuff, and that's kind of.
yeah.
I mean, there are definitely some business pluses, but also minuses, considering that we have totally different academic systems in with regards to how can an objective can be achieved in academic terms, or how do you educate a new student, a young person about life and so on and so forth. So that's quite interesting, considering that we all countries are trying to develop a system that is more academically friendly and scientifically friendly to an international connection, to tolerance, to
Hmm.
coexistence, to travel, to trade, and so on. I don't want to bother you with these things, however. I just want to go a bit into a bit more geopolitics, if that's okay. And I would like to go a bit,
Sure.
to give people an understanding what is happening. So I'll take it one country at a time. Difficult countries to talk about, not only about West Asia, or we can call it like that, Middle East, West Asia, but also East Asia. I want to go a bit in Afghanistan. And I know that you have
Okay.
field expertise in Afghanistan, and then I'll go to Iraq and so on. What is happening in Afghanistan right now? How are things going? What are we to expect?
Afghanistan is a disaster of epic proportions right now. I mean, I'm not being melodramatic in
Mm-hmm.
describing this. I think that it's even from the discussion that we were just having about certain norms, certain values that we want to address, that we consider common shared values of an international system that favors, um, the whether you're looking at young girls going to school, whether you consider entrepreneurship, whether you consider free will, democracy, whatever values you want to assign, all those have taken, an enormous step backwards. And not to bore you with it, because we can obviously talk about it for
Yeah.
forever. But since August of 2021, when the fall of the country to the Taliban, by all accounts, if you're looking at violence, for example, obviously violence has diminished because they're now totally in control. But it hasn't evaporated. ISIS is still present there. Various other terror groups are in some ways being hosted there, and in other ways they're just existing there. And I think that we're going to probably end up with similar problems in terms of the space that these groups fester in, for um, that we faced in the late 1999, 2000, 2001, prior to September 11th.
It seems that somehow they got access to International Monetary Fund money for construction.
Yeah,
It seems that
yeah,
Turkey
yeah.
has recently recognized the embassy under the leadership of the
Yes.
Taliban. Isn't this a big game changer somehow? I mean, it was kind of expected. I mean, in some
Look,
ways, but you know.
the difference between 2001 and now is that, quite frankly, the Taliban have not just, they can boast that they haven't defeated one superpower, they've defeated two. But at the end of the second defeat, they ended up with about $7 billion worth of hardware from the U.S. And a state that, to a degree, is far better oriented for them to control than 1996, when they took over previously from another civil war that had just about destroyed a good chunk of Afghanistan. So I think that it's a real reversal, and there's 30 million people that are struggling.
Is there a chance of a regime change or policy change or
No,
somehow going
not
back
anytime
to?
soon. And quite frankly, there's
Hmm.
not a chance, not anytime soon. And unfortunately, I also completely disagree with the idea of just, handing them cash to effectively, in budget sort of working
Hmm.
capital for them to earmark for humanitarian reasons. I don't trust them as much as I can throw them. So I don't think that that's the right way, which is terrible to say, because now you play the card of, well,
Yeah, yeah.
okay, a good part of the country is going to be in disarray, even worse, or perhaps near starvation. And these are great comments and great thoughts to have before you leave wholesale. But after you leave wholesale, and now you have certain, decision points that you need to, some forks in the road, just handing them cash isn't good enough. So I think that we have to have a much bigger, deeper conversation about Afghanistan as a world,
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
just,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
just
yeah.
abandoning it to even UN auspices is bad.
It seems that countries like Qatar or Turkey have been quite helpful in the initial reconstruction, at least if you remember correct, the airports, the how to fly, how to operate, how to
Sure.
administer, even the changes in the educational system. They seem to be very helpful at it. What about Iraq? I mean, Iraq, I know is far in a far better state than what it used to be, and definitely far better than Afghanistan. But we all know also the dynamics and the attempts for to bring it somehow a balance within Iraq. Now we've seen Iraq that it's now exporting bigger and bigger proportions of oil. We see a proportion of reconstruction in the country with mega projects coming up. Is Iraq back at it? We saw the golf football tournament recently. It was
Yeah.
an overall
Great.
success, uh,
Yeah.
with minor issues, especially in the beginning. But what do you make out of Iraq? I mean, what is happening, and what is the potential? People are seeking new investments, new opportunities. What's happening in Iraq?
Look, Iraq is. I know that a lot of people want to see Iraq through the lens of U.S. Iran competition. Previously, it was U.S. counterterrorism with ISIS. Before that, it was U.S.
Hmm.
counterterrorism towards Al Qaeda. Before that was Saddam Hussein
Full of
and his
wars.
minions. But the reality of it, 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, which was, only a few days ago, the anniversary, I think that one of the pitfalls of any strategy that deals with Iraq is the fact that people want to kind of talk about Iraq in the sense of a great game, but they don't want to talk about Iraq for the sake of Iraq. And I think Iraq has enormous potential, not just the natural tendencies to go straight to number three oil producer, in terms of reserves. But the reality of it is also that it's got a population that's highly educated. It's a population that is, energetic. It's got um, just about everything that you need for a country to be self-sufficient and growing, but it's dealing with major problems. And whether you want to call the kleptocracy that's existed for quite some time, or the corruption that has existed, these are terms that are being used. These are not my terms. But I would say that I would actually label it that it has some governance issues, in part because when the US went into Iraq in 2003, the government that we put in place, the constitution that we put in place, the mechanisms of civil governance were very clumsy, and in essence count the existing model, which of course was the Ba'athist regime, but you can't just advance it into something else without milestones along the way and time for it to grow. So I think there's still some growing pains that Iraq is going through that they'll get through. Everybody hopes they do. And you also have a brand new government that's only been in place since October, and that also has to get their feet under them, and they have some challenges because they're based on a system. Their election law created one form of parliamentary, the composition of parliament was not what created this government. The parliamentary system produced
Yeah.
a plurality of various parties that just disagreed with what was happening, and they couldn't form a government, and therefore about half of it walked away, and the rest of it formed a government. So it's not a little less than half, obviously, but it's a challenging environment politically, but it's obviously has enormous economic potential, and the human resource potential, and the excitement, as you described with the cup that they just had, the football cup. I mean, you
Let
could see
me.
that people
Yeah.
actually want to advance. They don't want
Yeah.
to stay in the dark ages of, post 2003 invasion.
Two problems: uh,
Sure.
Tiger and Euphrates, and number two, the biggest area location where water is actually lacking, where even the
Yeah,
United Nations has stressed that the first
sure.
impacted area with lack of water, where it will turn into desert and probably worse because there is not a single drop of water, is an area that Iraq apparently is trying to revive through massive forestation and massive attempts to water these areas. But then again, we go back to Tiger and Euphrates. And it's a very important
Yeah,
subject because it affects also Syria and Turkey as well. And it seems that Turkey has been doing
yeah,
its own share, has its own share of blame in this. And this is not probably the first one, but the reasons why these things happen, we all know that it's lack of natural resources around the world. So we're yet to see even more of those things happening. So what is your take on this?
well, I mean, look, climate change is real. I know that some people want to kind of play it down, and whether it's just man-made or cyclical, or however you want to label it, there are some impact that climate change is having on the Middle East, and in this particular case in Iraq. But beyond climate change and the challenges that are associated with climate change, there is that, as you very accurately depicted, there is a water scarcity issue that I think plays into geopolitics and, quite frankly, decisions that various countries are making. So Iraq is paying the price for decisions that Turkey and Iran are making, and for the rivers that you described. And so it's a major issue. I think it's, water wars are going to be far more challenging and enduring than any of the other wars that we've had. In fact, I would argue, and I think that you would agree, that Ukraine is more of a war of resources
Yes,
than anything
yes.
else.
I was expecting you would say that.
So,
Yes,
so
yes.
yeah, so at the end of the day, we are dealing with a situation in which I think, quite frankly, Turkey's decisions have been look, every country has to look out for their own interests. So I'm not going to throw away, the fact that Turkey has certain needs and certain, interests that it needs to protect. But its decisions and President Erdogan's decisions when it comes to water have been incredibly damaging to northern Syria and Iraq.
Having said that, I just want to add that Ukraine, you're right. You're absolutely right. Some may actually say that it's all about resources, and in fact, we all know that Ukraine can provide resources, not only grain but also other sources from oil to olive oil to flour oil to a lot of other things, and that it does already produce and already exports, but also metals. And
Yeah,
someone can claim that this is exactly why the war is happening. Although I do not deem that this war is new. I mean, it already started in 2014 with Crimea, but I don't want to divert the discussion towards that end in that area. But
sure.
maybe if we have a bit of time in the end, we can say a few things about Ukraine. But the most important thing is that you mentioned at some point that the north side has very much to do so of Syria, of Iraq, has to do also with Syria. So let me just move into Syria.
Hmm.
We saw Bashar
Sure.
al-Assad. He visited the United Arab Emirates, an otherwise country that would not recognize easily. Yeah, I mean, it was against Assad basically in what Assad did and what the civil war, how the civil war erupted. But then again, some years later, we see Bashar al-Assad be joined visiting the UAE on an official visit, where His
Hmm.
Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed says it's time for you to come back. And in fact, he's somehow right in the ideology and somehow right in the positioning. The question is, what is
Hmm.
happening in Syria? Who is Bashar al-Assad protected from? Because here's another irony: the West claims that he's protected by Russia, by Vladimir Putin, and his presence in Latakia and the powers to be, and so on and so forth. While we have competition between U.S. and Russian forces in Syria, you also have some Turkish forces there. There are constant bombings. Lately, there have been bombings from Israel to Syria, targets that actually influence Iran, who they also claim that Iran has an influence in Syria. What's happening in Syria? Are we to see stability in Syria soon enough?
No. Next question. I'm just kidding. I mean, uh, the issue is so complex because it also deals with various sections of the country. And Bashar al-Assad, I don't think, he's proven that he's not going anywhere. And I think a lot of countries are finalized, are looking at it from the perspective of we need to consider what's going to happen, and whatever we thought would happen, it hasn't happened. I mean, he's not going to get overthrown. He's not going to get, removed. There's no imminent regime change. The contribution of various countries in Syria have been measured and episodic and in different phases. So, the barrel bombing of various cities by the Russians and Syrian regime to quelch the revolution is come and gone. The countering ISIS. I think that the Syrian Democratic Forces and the coalition, the U.S. led coalition, is still fighting ISIS in northeast Syria. I'm not so sure that the Syrian regime is fighting ISIS so much in their areas. There's problems with Turkey and the infringement of Turkish forces, both in northwest and as of late in northern Syria. And I think there was, after the Istanbul bombing, there was besides the bombing campaign that the Turks undertook in northern Syria, there was we came very close, and I think thankfully it was averted, that we didn't have another serious ground invasion
But they never.
into
I mean,
northern Syria.
they never left. I mean, I thought you would come to this, but I was also asked at some point in the news, especially in Greece,
Yeah.
what do you think they will they attack? Will they attack ground forces from Turkey to Syria? And said, well, they never left. They were always there. Whether they wanted to expand is
Well,
a different story, but they're there.
they are there, but I think that they were talking about a much wider, expansive sort of engagement, and the pushing back of the
Hmm.
kilometers by kilometers into Syrian territory to create a buffer zone. I think that they probably realized that that would have turned into a much more serious engagement with the Syrian defense. I think it would have made things worse. They've opted for an increase to a degree of the Syrian-backed, or I'm sorry, the Turkish-backed Syrian militias. They've kind of, it's kind of equalized. But don't forget, we obviously have elections coming up
Yes.
in Turkey and in Greece and in other places, and I think obviously that's going to play down the road. So stand by. But I think the biggest issue is that Northeast Syria in particular, it's been sort of on pause. I mean, a lot of people, where are we going? Is it going to remain autonomous? Is it going to come under some kind of a Syrian regime accommodation? That hasn't been resolved. But what I can tell you for a fact is that the Russians aren't going anywhere. The Iranians aren't going anywhere. If anything, the Iranians are building for the long game. And the Iranians are playing a game that is far more long term, because it's a Shia entity in a deeply Sunni environment, and so part of their game is, how do we convert things? How do we? But they have a different perspective too, Maria. They're not interested in just Syria for itself. It's a throughway, from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus and then down to Beirut. That is a
It's a
pathway
pathway, yeah.
that they are
Yeah.
considering along the way. If the Chinese have the Belt and Road, the
The
Iranians have a
Iranians have
very
their own.
limited but equally as significant pathway for them.
Ioannis, I know that we can take hours and hours in discussing all other Middle Eastern countries
Sure,
along the way. With that being said, you know that we're doing this at Strategy International. We are out of Cyprus. The
sure,
idea is that we enhance this dialogue of civilizations from Cyprus to the world. It is very unfortunate that these
sure.
things happen in our regional area of concern. But, having said that, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to join our web series talk. I know that you're a busy man. You're traveling a lot, also in the Middle East. We do invite you to come and visit us also in Cyprus, so we can
I would love that. I'd
have
love that.
our own discussions here in physical presence. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm definitely sure we're going to have the opportunity to see each other again in not only in our web series but also other things that may take place. Thank you very much, Ioanni. Thank you.
Now, Maria, thank you for having me. And I know I probably should have mentioned in the beginning, but what you're doing is really important, because this dialogue is not just something between you and me. You're doing it with other key personalities, far smarter and more involved than me. But I think that the key component is that you're creating an ecosystem of strategists that are, that the network is greater than the sum of the network is greater than each of the parts. So thanks for what you're doing. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ioannis. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us in this episode of Strategy International. Please subscribe, follow, and like on our social media and YouTube channel. And make sure you follow us on our next episode soon to come. My name is Dr. Mario Eftimiopoulos, and I'm the head of Strategy International. And remember, impact makes a difference.